Hi, my name is Michael Bruinix, and I'm a clinical social worker at a hospital here in Kingston, Ontario. Today I want to talk to you about transference, which is a key concept in therapy. Transference is a very complex topic. It spans over thousands of books and journal articles. It's been written about since 1895 when Freud first coined the term. And after 125 years, there's actually no standard definition of what transference is. So in this video and a couple of subsequent ones, I'm going to break down my interpretation of transference. And the reason I say that is because there are so many schools of thought about this. It's such an integral part of therapeutic work. Researchers such as Dahl et al. In 2017 stated that whether you're practicing evidence-based practice type therapy or not, transference is present. There's other factors, there's other variables that influence the interaction between two people, and transference is one of those very important unconscious mechanisms that really shapes the outcome and the exchange in therapy. So I think it's worth looking at. One of the first things I think it's important to understand is that transference is simply when your client is having a strong positive or negative reaction to you. It can also occur when the client has a weak reaction. In other words, you say something that's very bold, maybe confrontational or strong, and there's hardly any reaction. Or it can be you say something very small, and then there's a huge reaction. So it's about intensity, duration, whether it's positive or negative. And what's happening here is that basically our clients are traveling in a time machine. When we're here in the present working with them, they're going back into their past, different parts of themselves. Maybe it's a wounded part, a younger part, an adolescent part. And there's different maturational stages that people go through. And some people get stuck in some of those stages, particularly emotionally. When something is under developmental arrest, like Heinz Kohut mentioned in the 60s and 70s, what happens is our clients kind of freeze. It's like they don't emotionally grow. They don't continue on. This can often be a result of trauma, but it doesn't always have to be. Simply, it's just that we store relationships from our past often in our unconscious mind, meaning we cannot consciously remember every single exchange, but we have this overall impression whether a relationship was strong, loving, caring, kind, or it was destructive, traumatic, and possibly toxic and hurtful. These relationships get stored in our memory, and they start to create dynamics where we are either trusting and loving and caring and kind around people, or we're distrusting. Maybe we are feeling certain emotions of fear or anger or shame around people. And this is all shaped by our previous relationships. There's an interesting hypothesis by Ronald Fairbairn who stated that we are a sum of all the relationships we've ever experienced. This work by Fairbairn led to Bowlby and others looking at attachment and seeing how people are shaped. In other words, our identity, our sense of self can be determined by the positive or negative experiences that we experience with other people. And it's that sum total that can leak out during our exchange when we're working with clients and they are either confused as to their reaction. They don't know suddenly why they were angry or upset. They don't understand what it was that you did or didn't do that created them feeling a very strong connection to you. And so Freud stated that this is coming from the client's unconscious, and that we have to understand these mechanisms, because what transference does is it causes our clients to keep repeating the past. He called it repetition compulsion. So if you've got a client that bounces from toxic relationship one after the other, or they're involved with family and children's services and they keep having involvement and they can't seem to turn around their behavior, often relationship dynamics, even with themselves, it gets skewed somehow. It's not how they want it to go, but they don't know why it's not going the way they want it to go. Often these are intrapsychic dynamics that are now being played out in interpersonal dynamics. So transference is a really important part of understanding all of that. The next thing I want to touch on is that after we realize, okay, when a client is in the moment with us and they have traveled back into the past, in other words, some relationship from the past is coloring their view of the present, positively or negatively, is that the way transference works is it's very unique. It's written in a language that is not immediately understood. In other words, we might think on the surface, on layer one, we're understanding the verbal content of what the client's saying. We might even feel like we're able to access their affect or their emotions. But to understand where all that's coming from, to understand their worldview, why they're talking about that right now, I kind of liken it to hieroglyphics, which is why I chose hieroglyphics to be on the front of my second ebook, The Path to the Shadow. See, because hieroglyphics on the surface look like the way those symbols are designed when you see people just looking from the side is that it looks like when you're looking at them, it should make immediate sense. If you see someone carrying a bundle of wheat, you're thinking, okay, this has something to do with either measurement of farm or productivity. If you see someone carrying spears of war or they're in a chariot, you'd think, okay, this has got something to do with warfare. But actually, those symbols are very complex because of how they get joined together. It's not each individual symbol that makes the entire mosaic when you're looking at something complete. They tell a story. And same thing with our clients when they're talking to us is that there's layers underneath. There's often multiple layers going on when we're talking to them. So we might be talking in the present about a relationship that they're in. Could be with their parents or their spouse or their child. And then there's all sorts of undertones, all sorts of layers underneath that have shaped their worldview right now from the previous experiences that they had in other relationships. And then that in turn affects how they interact with us. And so in a way, it's almost like learning how to read another language. We're not looking at the surface of what they're saying. We're not looking at the emotions. We're looking at what's underneath the unconscious content. And Freud stated that looking at the unconscious through transference is a way to have a window directly into them to see key relationships that shape them, that are influencing them right now, and potentially keeping them stuck in patterns that they don't want to be stuck in. So what happens here is when our clients are telling us something, you have to keep in mind that when I talk about something being in the unconscious, we know from neurobiology there's no such thing as the unconscious. It's not like a physical location. They've mapped out over 1,000 areas in the brain. It's not that it's hidden in terms of being located in a physical structure. What I mean by that is it's just hidden from them in this moment. Maybe you have had the experience where you're talking with a client and then spontaneously they remember something they haven't remembered before. It was always there, it's just they didn't have access to it. So what you want to look at here with transference is the idea that sometimes they're telling us stories and those stories aren't entirely true. They just are stories they've told themselves over and over again, and they don't really know why they've said it, they don't know how they acquired it, and they just keep saying it. So for example, I've worked many times with clients that say, I'm a failure. It's very common to have low self-esteem. They've had trauma in their background. They don't feel like they're having the success that they want. But then when I calmly and rationally point out all the successes that they've had up until now, they discount them. So there's some protective mechanism inside them. I use the symbolism from Jung's talking about the shadow, that there's this shadow inside of them that wants to protect them from being harmed. Freud said that the reason people use defenses is to protect the ego from being wounded. In other words, we don't want to lower our self-esteem. So we compartmentalize different pieces of information, different memories, different experiences in order to protect ourselves from any kind of harm, any kind of long-lasting harm. And so sometimes our clients are telling us stories that aren't true. It's just they've rehearsed it and hypnotized themselves saying it so many times that it now has become true. When you challenge them with that story, they may get upset and have a reaction from the past that is influencing them now in this moment. So for example, if I had a client that said, no, I'm not athletic, I'm sedentary, I don't do a lot of exercise. And then you remember from other sessions that they told you when they were younger, they were an exceptional athlete, that they did something really well in school. Maybe they ran for track or they went to OFSA or something like that. And then when you remind them of the facts, it's like they can't hold those two pieces of information at once. On the one hand, they feel sedentary now and they don't feel like they can do anything. But on the other hand, they remember that they did do something and that they did have something positive in their life. There's all kinds of examples when you're talking with clients where the facts don't fit their emotions or their self-view. And the reason that's happening is those relationships from the past have colored how they're looking at themselves, and now it's affecting their beliefs. It's affecting their sense of agency, their sense of work or play, and their sense of self. So what do we do? Well, interestingly, Freud was suggesting, as have many other clinicians over the last 125 years, that we have to let them put the transference onto us. It's like what I call a relationship graft, meaning they have these previous relationships in the past. Let's say I'm an authority figure, right? I'm working with them in a session, and they're feeling like maybe I'm the expert and they're the student and they have to learn. And so what we do is we let them put the transference onto us, that we let them take their old relationships and then place them onto us. Freud talked about being a clear screen. Of course, that's not true. We know now from research that how the therapist talks, what kind of eye contact that they have, their gestures, what they focus in on, what they don't, has a major impact. We can't just be a blank screen like he suggested. But the idea was that he was trying to get at was that we want to let them put their old relationships onto us. In other words, let's say I'm working with a client and they feel like I'm sort of a father figure. Well, we would be tempted to say, no, that's not true, and try to remind them of reality and stick with the facts and talk about things. But actually, many amazing clinicians, including Heinz Kohut and Kernberg, suggest that you let them explore the relationship. Oh yeah, in what ways am I like your father? Oh yeah, how do I remind you of him? What is it that I say or do? And then when you go into that, what's happening is they're going back in that time machine. It's reminding them of the things that are upsetting them about that relationship. Meanwhile, we're working with them in the present, and we get a glimpse into their past. We get to see, where did that relationship get interrupted? Where did it go well? Where did it not go so great? So we want to let them kind of, like a skin graft, we want to let them put it onto us and then explore it rather than try to resist it. So it takes a special type of approach in order to work with someone's transference rather than trying to push it off. So as an example, when I've worked with trauma survivors, sexual assault trauma survivors in the past, when they said, oh, you remind me of your perpetrator, inwardly I cringed. Oh, I don't want to resemble that at all. And so I fought really hard to say, well, no, I'm different from them, or, that can't be true. And that was early in my clinical practice. So I didn't know then that that's just part of the natural healing process, that in fact, clients want to explore their previous relationships with us now. And when they do that, when they're given a safe place and a creative place to explore that, what happens is they can start to repair the broken relationships inside of them. Freud and many other clinicians have said that when you let the transference happen, you're letting them heal. You're stopping the repetition compulsion, because what's going to happen is if you push it away, they're just going to find someone else to graft it onto. They're going to find, their landlord, another worker that they're working with. It could be a psychiatrist or a doctor. It could be another, a new partner in their life, where they just have to keep repeating this transferential pattern over and over. And by that, I mean, there's just this relationship in the past that's kind of been haunting them, upsetting them, and they want to work it through. So it's really important when you're working with someone with transference is to let it happen, to allow it to come in and then explore it. Now, there's a few things that you want to keep in mind with transference. One is it's got different elements. Certainly, when someone's taking an old relationship and now applying it in the present moment to us, there's certain rules, right? Just like when you sit down with your family at the table, every family has different rules around what being polite is, like whether you say please and thank you when you pass something, or whether you just hand it to someone, how you hold yourself, your comportment at the table, what you do or don't do. May I be excused from the table? We all know our family has different rules about just sitting at a table. I mean, there's thousands of unwritten rules inside of a family, and those come forward when you're exploring transference because it shapes the dynamic of it. One thing that's kind of interesting to explore with transference is, what are the rules around what they're thinking or what they're doing? And also, what are their expectations? So what are they expecting us to do? If we remind them of someone from their past, what are they thinking we're going to do? Here's an example. Someone thinks, I'm like their father. Okay, what was your father like? Well, he was really harsh. He was really critical. He criticized everything he did. Right there, in that small sentence, you can hear the expectation is, I'm going to criticize them too. Now, in therapy, we give feedback, but I'm sure you've had the experience where when you're talking with someone, and no matter how positive or constructive the feedback, they take it very personally. It really upsets them. And that's because it's reminding them of other relationships where someone gave feedback and they're not here in the room with you now. They're being linked to some other time or place that really upsets them. And then they get upset with you. And the key here is to let them have it, let them explore it. Try to figure out what's going on rather than trying to correct them or bring it back to, no, that wasn't my tone of voice. No, I didn't say it like that. I don't know why you're saying it like this. It's not to argue with them, it's to allow them to put the transference on you, take the old relationship, and then wear it like a new skin, and then see how they respond to us when we let them do it. Now, of course, they're going to have not just expectations around how we're going to act, they're also going to put themselves in certain roles. You may find suddenly a client in front of you is very childlike. Out of nowhere, you're talking about a particular topic, and then you can see them physically kind of regress. Now, they've just slipped into a role. And then you may say something, and suddenly they're mature, and they're not just mature, they're an adult. And now the roles are reversed. Now suddenly you're like you get the impression that they think of you like a child, and now they're the scolding adult giving you trouble for what you did or didn't do during the session, what you said or didn't say. So these roles are really important to identify as you're going along exploring transference. And then, of course, examining their reactions. So you say something to them and then they react very strongly, or it's an odd reaction, like it's kind of confusing. They don't know why you said something, they suddenly burst into tears, or they suddenly feel very angry. And you're like, inside, you know you didn't mean it like that. But that's the thing with transference, is something's going on from their past that's influencing how they're interacting with you now. So looking at how they react to things, that's worth exploring too. So we've got 4 things. We've got the rules that are in their mind around how this relationship should go. We've got the expectations, how do they think it should go. We've got their expectations and their roles. We've got the roles that they assume. And then we've got their reactions as all of this is occurring. Those are 4 things. So rules, expectations, and reactions. Now, so I'm bringing those up because when I'm exploring transference, those are 4 things that I look at. Those are little areas that I'm examining as someone's putting the transference on me, and then that gives me something to work with and a place to go. Now, one of the hard things about when you're working with someone with transference is it's almost like opening a book and you're just on page 275 and you don't really know the beginning of the story, but bang, suddenly you're right there. When you're working with someone with transference, often you just get dropped in the middle of their story. You don't know where it came from. You don't really know what's going on. You don't know which character you are in the story. Could you be a sibling? Could you be, a former partner? You remind them suddenly of a former partner. You don't know what role you've been given. You don't know the backstory on it. And so it can get a little disorienting, a little confusing when you start to explore transference, but that's perfectly natural. It's totally fine. What you want to do there is just ask curious, exploratory questions and see, they parachuted you in somewhere into that story, into that relationship, that dynamic, and it's really interesting where they select. So, for example, if someone says, okay, Michael, you remind me of my father. Oh, yeah? How old were you? Oh, they might choose 8. They might choose 16. They might say 24. Aha. So where they select, because the relationship evolves over time, right? You have a very different relationship with your father at 24 than you do at 8. So where they indicate they feel it is important as to where they parachute you in and drop you right into the middle of transference. That's one thing I often look at. And I just sort of take into account that if I'm feeling confused in a session, I don't know why they reacted a certain way, I don't know where this is going, that's very, very common. I mean, there's hundreds of clinicians that have commented on this, that the transference just simply takes over and you have to kind of roll with it. And if you're a beginning therapist, you might feel confused or like, I don't know what to focus on. But the confusion is part of the transference. This is often why it's so complicated. You know, out of studying it over 125 years, we have no one unified definition of what transference is. There's many different schools of thought that have different opinions on what transference is. For example, some people think it's the total reaction of our client. So it's the sum total of everything that they experience. Other people think it's just a section or it's a part of a relationship or a dynamic that they're trying to explore. Some think it's in the unconscious. Some think it's conscious and unconscious. There's many different views about transference. So what you want to do here is just realize that when you get parachuted in somewhere in a story, meaning they just suddenly have a positive or negative reaction that's seemingly inexplicable to you or them, that it's an error in time. This is a phrase from Freud, again, where they think the past is happening right now. And what happens is we get a window into their past, and they have to reassess and figure out where the present is. In other words, they're really stuck in the past and they can't access the present. We're in the present and we're peering like a window into their past because of how the transference is affecting them. Now, in my second book, I talk about 3 different skills of working with transference. One is story listening, the other is story directing, and the third is working with transference. It's a quick ebook, it's about 55 pages, where I summarize all the research that I compiled about transference. So I talked about this idea of people having a shadow, and I want to get into that a little bit right here because it's very important. The shadow is the part of us that engages in behaviors that we wish we didn't. It's the part of us that we can't seem to stop. We have compulsions. We don't know why we can't stop. And that's why I call it the shadow. This is using the Jungian archetype of the shadow. And in that, what I mean is it's hidden from us. Like, I've had many clients that say, I wish I could stop smoking. I wish I could stop overeating. I wish I could start exercising. And they don't know why. And that's because their shadow is hiding this information, not just from us, but from them. And the shadow is an ally. It's a protective mechanism. It keeps information away from the client that would have put them in jeopardy when they were younger. So, for example, if a child, 4 or 5 years old, when they're being physically harmed by their parent, if they said what was really on their mind, that could lead to further harm. We learn to compartmentalize these parts of us that know the truth. It's what Winnicott called the false self versus the true self. And we protect the true self with this sort of false self, this facade. We put masks on. We pretend that we're this way when actually we're that way. And the reason we do that is to keep our core self safe. The shadow it's like bark on a tree. It protects us from the elements. It protects us from other people harming us. It's a very important element that, on the one hand, it creates resistance in the therapy because it's always hiding. It's always concealing little parts, and then it reveals parts, and it's quite confusing for both the client and sometimes the clinician. But it has a protective mechanism there. It's keeping the person whole and intact. Often what happens is the shadow uses a series of defenses. Some easy ones are like intellectualization, rationalization, moralization, compartmentalization. And what's happening there is you learn to start using your mind to protect yourself from feeling certain things. If you can rationalize and you can intellectualize, you don't have to feel your feelings as much. You can talk about your feelings rather than feeling your feelings. It has distinct advantages. Sigmund Freud and Anna Freud discovered 33 different defenses that people use. There are some lists on the internet that say there's 106. I don't know. I think 33 is enough. So why I'm bringing that up is part of what the shadow does is it uses defenses to block us and the client from accessing information or accessing the true self in terms of expressing what they really want to say, what they really want to do, because that used to get them in trouble. And this is why they're bringing those old relationships to us in therapy, is because they've somehow handcuffed them there. They don't feel authentic. They don't know why they don't have energy. They don't know why they can't do the things that they really want to do. But that's what happens when the false self hardens like cement. If it kind of bakes into their personality, in other words, they're wearing a mask but they can't get it off, it starts to feel like that's all they can do. So when that happens and they've used defenses to get this far, it's had a great adaptive survival mechanism, but the problem is that every defense has a limitation. For example, if always use the defense of humor, meaning every time someone says something to me and I crack a joke, well, that doesn't work very well. It actually keeps people away from me, right? So if I'm constantly cracking jokes, you can't get emotionally close to me. That's a great defense. It looks like you're cooperating. It looks like you're blending in, and it might work in social settings, but it certainly doesn't work in in an intimate relationship. It doesn't work at funerals. It doesn't work when there's lots of circumstances. Say at work, there's a very serious situation. This is not the time to crack a joke, but if you have that defense in there, you can't stop yourself. You see, so that's an example of a more benign defense. But what I'm trying to say here is that the shadow is like a movie director. It knows what to reveal and what not to reveal. It tries to protect the person from being harmed. Here's an easy example. Let's say a client comes to you and they want to talk to you about a wedding that they just went to on the weekend. Okay? The wedding was 4 hours long. If you don't interrupt the client, they might talk for an hour about that wedding, and they're telling you different events that happened. And what's happening there is the shadow's like a movie director. It's putting your attention on these different events when in reality it was a key conversation with their mother when they were sitting at the head table where the mother said, you've always been a disappointment. Look at your brother. He's here. He's getting married. You're not married. Like, what's your problem? But do you hear that in the session? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe that's concealed and they're telling you everything else about it and they look kind of agitated and upset and you don't really know what they're getting at. Or they tell you that statement just in passing and then they move along. This is an example of where the shadow is protecting them from some kind of wound, some kind of harm, and then it's up to us to try to figure out what's going on with the transference that's influencing them to keep the defense going. And what it is if they don't feel safe, right? Like maybe they're worried that we as clinicians were going to judge them. Hey, why are you not married? Or what happened that you don't have children, you don't have your own family. And they don't want to have that kind of attack or what they feel like is something that really hurts them deeply. So then their shadow can simply talk about all kinds of other things, many topics. Instead of bringing up the wedding at all, they could start talking about how they renovated their house. And you're sitting there across from them like, why do you keep telling me about your renovations? We're trying to change something in here. So the transference can have very complex and very subtle mechanisms that make it really interesting to explore. And when I was taking a workshop with Dr. Rex Kay from the University of Toronto, he said it's really important to cultivate this attitude of curiosity. And I think that's true. I think it's important to be curious as to where these reactions are coming from, why they're having strong positive or negative reactions towards us. And then we have to go with them rather than trying to fight against them. So for me, that's a great start as to the efficacy of transference in a session when you're working with clients and they're trying to create a change and they don't know why they're resisting the change. In fact, many clinicians, including Otto Rank and Ferenczi, there's several clinicians that have commented along the way that Greenson that talk about how transference is very closely related to resistance. It's when people are experiencing transference, there's a high level of resistance to change because there's some dynamic inside of them that's not working out very well. They kind of partially experience it. They don't know why they feel a certain way. And then they can't make any kind of change because they don't really consciously know what they're trying to work on. There's some deeper dynamics at work that they're currently inaccessible to the client, and then they can't make the change. So why would it be so hard for a client to simply own up to transference, look at the past relationships, and then move forward? Well, it comes down to it feels like an assault on their reality. They've got such a baked-in worldview. They've had thousands of interactions with people that make them either feel good about themselves or not so good about themselves. And if you've had many negative interactions, it's going to be really hard to change your self-view. So, for example, if I had a client who had low self-esteem, low confidence, They feel like it's hopeless. No one can really help them. And then I'm going in there saying, well, what a great person you are. Look how great you are with your kids. Look how great you are, here in this session. Look how open-minded you are. The transference will keep the story going. No, you don't remember all the failures I had. You don't understand. If you really knew me, you'd know why I take this position. And that's because when we challenge those beliefs, when we challenge those dynamics and those patterns, it really is an assault on their reality. They think this is like three-dimensional, it's real. That's why they cling to it so tightly. But there's another part of them that knows, no, something's off course, something's off base. Why is it that no matter what I succeed, no matter what I do, I don't feel good inside? So that we have little alarm bells often comes from our wise mind, where we realize that we have these thoughts, we believe them, but then there's a small part of us that starts to doubt whether they're real or not because they're not getting us where we want to go. And that's our opportunity to start working with the transference rather than fighting it and questioning why they keep doing what they're doing and resisting them. You have to go with the flow instead of against it. So the last thing I'm going to touch on here is that when we have negative transference in the room, it can be very difficult to deal with. In other words, if a client just continually dislikes us, if they're continually angry, if they're continually upset, it can be very, very difficult just to tolerate the transference. But it's very important to let them keep putting it on you until they can figure out what's going on underneath there so that they can see you clearly rather than the relationship they're superimposing on you. One of the strongest reasons for therapy or working with someone in a therapeutic setting, one of the strongest reasons that it comes to a stalemate is that the negative transference hasn't been examined. So what I mean by that is we don't let them, we can sometimes be busy, we as clinicians or workers can be busy defending ourselves from the assaults, the attacks, the criticism that they're putting on us. If someone says, you're doing a terrible job right now, I'm not getting any better, like, why do you think you should be even doing therapy? Like, where'd you get your degree from? It doesn't make any sense to me. I'm really upset with what you're doing in here. That can be hard to hear time and time and time again. And some clients, they have to work with us for weeks or months or years to try to break through these transferential patterns, these old relationships that have cemented in their mind, and now they only have that view to look at the world or look at themselves. So if we don't examine the negative transference, if we keep trying to backpedal away from it, if we try to defend ourselves, if we try to say, no, that's not it, actually, this is what I meant when I said this. If we start getting in those kind of power struggles about what reality is, we don't start working with the transference, and then we just start to feel stalemated after a while. It's very common, as human beings, we can feel upset that someone continually attacks us, or they're disappointed in us, or they feel like what we're doing isn't working, or we're not being effective. And so after a while, we can start having countertransference, which I'm going to get into in later videos, where we start having a strong positive or negative reaction with our clients. And this dynamic, they interlock, transference and countertransference, they interlock in very complex and interesting ways. So what I'm saying here is that sometimes when we resist the transference from our client, it leads to a stalemate. You might be hearing a story over and over again, and in your mind, you're like, oh man, we've covered this again and again. But the reason it keeps coming up, the reason it keeps coming back is because they have transference they're trying to work through. They're trying to communicate in this hidden, secret, unconscious language that's protected by their shadow, where they're concealing and revealing. And then they're trying to get our attention and hopefully work through it so that they can resolve it and heal from it rather than keep repeating it. So examining, letting them have their negative transference, and then rolling with it, and then examining it and trying to help them work through it so that they can see us instead of the relationship, have a more clear cognitive reappraisal, maybe some reframing of how they view themselves or the world. That's a very important element in transference. With this video is going to be broken into two parts, so we're ending up on the first one here. The reason that transference is so important is because if you are working with a client and you're gridlocked, you're stalemated, you can't figure out how to move forward. Often it's negative transference with the client that keeps both of you locked in place. The research on this for the past 70 years is immense. There's been many great clinicians who have examined this mechanism of transference. Some have dedicated their entire career just to transference in order to let us know that these dynamics are very, very important to be aware of, whether you're engaging in DBT, CBT, some evidence-based practice. They're still occurring anyways, whether it's part of the model that you're working with or not. So in the next video, I'll cover the other half of like how do we work with it. Here I'm just trying to give you a foundation to think about what transference could be, how it might be occurring in your practice, giving you some concrete examples. So if you like this video, you might consider hitting the subscribe button or putting some comments down below where you can ask me some questions and I can reply to you. You could also email me at michaelbruinix@gmail.com. That's michaelbruinix@gmail.com. And I'd be happy to either send you one of the 3 ebooks or the ebooks that I've written. You can also directly ask me about parts of this that I can help you with. And if you want, you can also take this video and potentially share it with teammates or other mental health professionals that could use it. The reason I'm doing these types of videos is to help you have a better competency and confidence in your practice, and I hope that it helps in some way. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.